Hi, I'm Katie Stope. I'm the local history librarian at Appleton Public Library, and today I'm going to talk to you about census records. Just a quick note, this is not a live recording from our session last week. Unfortunately, there was an issue with the recording, so I am re-recording it. So just because of that, this will not be an exact replica of what our live session was last week, since the questions and answers that were asked during the session are not going to be included in this. If you do have any questions after you watch this, go ahead and feel free to email me. My email address is on the screen, kstope@apl.org. I also want to remind you that you can see our YouTube channel for past recording sessions. So of course, since you're watching this on YouTube, you probably realize that this is part of a whole series. So we did the first session on getting started in genealogy. The second session was on vital records, and then the census records is our third session. So go ahead and watch any of the other sessions, and if you need any of the other handouts from our previous sessions, you can email me as well. So without further ado, let's get started learning about census records. So first, what is the census? A census, hopefully you know what it is, but if not, it's an official complete count of a population of a nation, state, or other geographic region. So you might have heard survey and think a census is similar to a survey, but a survey just takes a small sampling of people, maybe 100 people or 1,000 people, whereas the census is aiming to count every single person, which could be millions or billions of people. So they say the goal of the census is to count everyone once, only once, and in the right place. But in reality, some people unfortunately are counted more than once. Some people are missed entirely, and then other people are also counted in the wrong place. So perhaps they split their time between two different residences, maybe one in Wisconsin and one in Florida, and their main residence is technically Wisconsin, but they were counted in the census in their Florida home. So things like that happen all the time, or perhaps they were counted in both places. The census also records information about the population's demographics, like their age, their sex, and their occupation. Our census also includes data about the region's agricultural and business sectors as well. So although a lot of the information collected in a census is used for statistical purposes, the data can also be a really great goldmine for genealogists like us. So why should we research the census when we're looking at genealogy? These are some of the main reasons. So of course, the census is going to help us document our family relationships and place our ancestor in a specific location at a specific time. So remember, that's the goal of genealogy, is to document our family relationships and to be able to locate our ancestors in certain records at a certain time period. Unfortunately, not every census is explicit about the relationships, and we'll get more into that in a little bit. And even the ones that do say specifically what the relationships are, you definitely want to verify them with additional sources. So everything that you find on the census, you want to verify. You can also learn more about your ancestors' life, like their occupation, how much schooling they've had, if they were a naturalized US citizen, if they owned their home or lived on a farm, etc. Details are going to vary depending on the census year and the census location. So year to year, from the 1910 to 1920 census, they asked different questions. And then, of course, the location is going to vary. So different states asked different questions during their state censuses. International countries ask different census questions than the US Census, for example. So again, every census record that you deal with is going to be different. The census can also give us some clues for additional research. So for example, you could find a birth year and a birth location for one of your ancestors, which could then lead you to discovering a birth record for your ancestor. So remember, last month we talked about vital records and how birth, marriage, and death records are really important to our genealogy. Well, if you don't know when your ancestor was born, this is a great tool to look in the census to be able to find an approximate birth year and location that could help you hopefully find an actual birth record for your ancestor. So what information is included in the census? So this is about the US Census. So again, each census is going to provide different data and ask different questions. So older US censuses before 1850 ask very few questions, and we'll dive into that a little bit later of how you deal with those pre-1850 censuses. And then unfortunately, some questions are only asked once on a census and never asked again. So again, every census is going to be different. But generally, for the censuses from 1850 to 1950, you're going to get certain information. And the reason why I say only up to 1950 is because of privacy laws, there is a 72-year hold on having access to the census. So I'll dive into that a little bit deeper a little later. But for right now, the ones that are accessible to us genealogists are only up to 1950 at this point. So in those censuses from 1850 to 1950, you're going to find a name of an ancestor, their age, a state or country of their birth, their parents' birthplaces, the year that they immigrated if they are an immigrant, their street address, their marital status, and how many years they've been married sometimes if they are married, their occupation or occupations if that's relevant, and then the value of their home and personal belongings as well. But keep in mind that information is during that time period. So that although it might say $200, that's not in today's terms of $200. There's a great link in your handout that details what questions were specifically asked in each census from 1790 all the way up to 2000. So go ahead and take a look at that link, which will give you a lot of detail. So here is that link, and this is where I got it from. It's the availability of census records about individuals from FactFinder for the nation through the Census Bureau. So again, it walks you through, this is what was asked in the 1820 census. This was asked in 1900. So you can see very few questions asked in the early censuses compared to these kind of 1900, 1910 censuses. And then again, they're going back to asking fewer questions in the last 1950 to 2000 time period. All right, here's an example of what a 1950 census looked like. So this is one of my ancestors who was enumerated in New York. So you can see they're right here in this area. So you see I get what dwelling number they're living at. I get the names of the people in the household, their age, their sex. This is the column for color. Unfortunately, this census taker did not write what color they were. The options were either white, black, or mulatto. But I'm assuming since this is New York, but if they were anything other than white, they would have indicated that. Next, I get that the occupation of my ancestor, and again, usually they only give that head of the household usually, unless there were other people for whatever reason, perhaps who were working in the household. You should also get a value of the real estate owned. So that's blank for my ancestor, but you can see it looks like they're living in the same house as another couple. So they are potentially renting in this location, and that's why that spot's blank there. Next, you get the place of birth. So either the state, territory, or country. And you see there's little ditto marks. So that means I have to look at the entry above to see my ancestor was born in New York. And then there's a couple columns that ask questions, and there's relevant tick marks there if that applies to that ancestor. So you can see very basic information is asked in the 1850 census, but still some helpful details that can help lead you to further research. In comparison, we're going to look at the 1950 census example. So in order to zoom in, hopefully I'm going to log into my Family Search account and pull it up here. So if you don't already have a Family Search account, you want to be sure to have one and then log into that before you try to dive into the records, because it's going to ask you to log in. So now I'm going to look at my grandfather and my great-grandparents in the 1950 census. So I can zoom in. Thankfully, Family Search highlights who I'm looking at here. So you can see, again, there's the house number. The address is going to be up here along the side of what street they're on. They're going to ask certain questions. They have the names of who's living in the house, what their relationships are, their race, their marital status, their age, things like that, marital status, sex, where they were born, and then again, other questions asked. So of course, if your ancestor is towards the bottom, you're gonna have to keep popping up here to see what these questions are they're asking. So there's a lot of occupational related questions, for example. So I'd go up there to see what they're asking up there, and then come back down here to see the relevant information for my ancestor. You'll also notice on the left and the right side, there's a couple different sample lines where certain people are asked additional questions. So if you're very lucky, one of your ancestors will have been asked one of these additional questions, and it's only for that one person in the household. So thankfully, my great-grandfather was one of the people selected in the 1950 census to be asked additional questions. So I can come down here and look for number 25, which was his line, and see what kind of questions they asked just specifically to him. So if he was living in that same house a year ago, things like that. What country were his parents born in, his highest level of school, some additional questions about occupation and wages, things like that. If they've ever served in the US forces, et cetera, et cetera. So again, if your ancestor was asked those additional questions, you definitely want to be sure to scroll all the way down to get those. Right. So now we're going to talk about how the census was conducted, specifically in the United States. So in the US, the census is taken federally, so a whole country, beginning in 1790, and then it's been taken every 10 years since. So 1790, 1800, 1810, 1820, etc. So the most recent census we have done was 2020. So hopefully you all remember completing that census 4 years ago almost. And then of course there's individual states in the United States and other countries that have also taken censuses at various points in time. So usually different years than the US federal census. So for example, Wisconsin as a state took a state census in 1855, 1865, 1875, 1885, and 1895, and 1905, as well as a few territorial censuses. So before they became a state in 1848, they took a few territorial censuses. So what I encourage you to do is to use the federal censuses, which are taken every 10 years. If there's a state census, those usually happen between the census years. So you can see, for example, I'd have the 1860 census, then the 1865 state census, and then the 1870 federal census. And then I can try to put my ancestors in a timeline. Then I can also use city directories and tax lists or other records, like newspaper perhaps, which we're going to be talking about next month, where I can try to see if my ancestor is there every year and try to create that timeline for where they're living, what time period they're living in that area. So I can try to follow them year to year and know where to research them. To get an idea of what census records exist for a different geographic location and how to access them for a specific place, you want to start with the Family Search Wiki, which will even list special censuses and give you any information on if there's a loss, perhaps, one of the state censuses was damaged or is no longer accessible for whatever reason. So to show you an example, I'm going to go into the Family Search Wiki quick. And right here, you're going to put in the state name or the country name and then the census. So I'm going to do New York Census. And now I can see, of course, it's going to talk about the online federal census for New York, which was included in all the censuses. It's going to have some information on the non-population schedules, which we'll talk about later on today. If there's any existing and lost federal censuses for New York, you can click on that and learn a little bit more. And then here they have the state and territorial censuses. And you can see things like it says counties are missing or select counties. And then there's links over here to show where you can access them. So if you see a little $, that means it's on a site that's going to require a subscription. But thankfully, many of these are available on Family Search, and I'll also show you in a little bit how to access them through Heritage Quest, which is very similar to Ancestry Library Edition, and how you could access that from home. But again, you can see a snapshot overview of what is included for New York ancestors. So if you had a New York ancestor at a certain time period, you might want to look in these censuses for them. You can also do this for any other country. So for example, I can put in Ireland census in the search box. And say I want to find my Irish ancestors. Now I can see all these various censuses that are taken along with links and information on how to use these collections as well and where they are. Again, if you see the little $, that means that those are only available on subscription sites at this time. We can also learn a little bit about the history of how that census was taken in this area, why they took the census, things like that. So different things about what might be in those censuses for those certain years as well. So some of these are very detailed and great. Some of them don't have as detailed information. It really depends on the country or the state that you're looking at. But this would be a great starting point for learning what censuses are available in the different regions you're looking for. So again, we're going to talk about how the census is conducted in the United States. So what happened was an enumerator, which is a census taker, they went door to door to talk to an adult of the household. So from 1790, when they first began the census, all the way up to 1870, they had the US Marshals being the enumerators, going door to door to talk to people. Then from 1870 on, enumerators were hired, and they're still hired to this day. So one of your ancestors could even be a census taker, or you could be a census taker for the next census if you'd like. There's a link in your handout for Measuring America. It gives you all the census questions and instructions that the census takers were given, and talks a little bit more in depth about how the census was conducted. So it might help you understand, this is why my ancestor answered the question like this. It's a very long document. There's a whole 149 pages all about the census from 1790 to 2000. So I definitely encourage you to take a look at that to learn a little bit more about the census than what I can cover today. So once the enumerators went to your ancestor's house, that head of the household, the adult in the house, provided information about each of the household's members. So unfortunately, other than in the 1940 census, we have no clue who is providing that information. It could have been a neighbor. It could have been the mother-in-law living in the house. It could have been the wife. It could have been the husband. It could have been an adult child that was living there. We have no clue other than in the 1940 census. In the 1940 census, you want to look for this X with a circle, or sometimes it's just an X if the census taker was a little sloppy. But you can see right here in this snapshot of the 1940 census, I know my great-grandma Florence was the one providing the information about everybody in the household. So I can kind of, based off that information that she's providing, know that her information is probably pretty accurate. And hopefully she would know information about her husband and her son that would be pretty accurate as well. So once that census taker went to your house and asked you questions, they'd make field notes. And then they took those field notes to the census office that were then copied to an official census record. So those official census records are what we as genealogists see nowadays. Be aware, unfortunately, this is where errors can happen anywhere along the way. So as your enumerator got information about you, they could have written it down wrong. As the person copying that information from the census taker was trying to read your handwriting, they could have got it incorrect. Believe it or not, people also providing information to that census taker could have misremembered or could have given incorrect information or deliberately falsified that information. So I always like to think when I'm looking at a census record, did my ancestor have a reason to lie about this? So for example, did they say they're a US citizen when they weren't, or that they hadn't finished the process, but they said that they were a US citizen anyways because maybe it was their neighbor or one of their friends or somebody they know personally that they would have been embarrassed to tell that person, I'm not a US citizen yet, or, I haven't finished the process. So maybe they just kind of told the little white lie, and that information then was recorded and believed to have been true, of course. And keep in mind, of course, that even neighbors sometimes were the people who were giving information about their neighbors. So, how much did your neighbor really know about you? Do they know where your parents were born, for example, or were they kind of just guessing, unfortunately? And again, in those early census years, we don't know who the informant is, so we don't know where that information is coming from. Keep in mind, before 1830, the government did not have any standard printed forms for the census. So they used their own paper, they lined by hand. So the census is not going to look the same from place to place when you're looking at those very early censuses from 1790 to 1830. Then beginning in 1960, the Census Bureau began mailing questionnaires to houses, and then they only went door to door to people who didn't respond by mail. So that's something that's, still true to this day. And you can now even complete the census online or by telephone. Still, even this way, the census is not 100% accurate. There's always going to be overcounting some people or undercounting other people. And again, you want to see that link in the handout for more information on the history of US Census taking. And then again, take a look at the Family Search Wiki to learn more about international censuses and how those were taken, since those were taken a little bit different than US censuses in many cases. Now we're going to talk about searching in the census. So one great thing about this computer age that we're in, all of the United States federal censuses up until 1950 are indexed and digitized online and available on many of the main genealogy websites like Family Search, Ancestry, both the paid edition and the library edition, and Heritage Quest, which you can again use through the library for free. And I'll show you an example of how to do that in just a second. And then some of the state censuses, some of those non-population schedules, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. And then some of the international censuses are also available on many of these genealogy websites, but unfortunately not all of them have been digitized. For example, I know that the Wisconsin non-population schedules are not online yet. Thankfully, our neighbors to the north at Brown County Library in Green Bay have microfilm of these non-population schedules. So for those of us who live in Appleton, it's not that far of a drive to go there to get that microfilm and look at those non-population schedules. And again, we'll talk about those in a little bit later. So using these websites, you can search for a person by name, but unfortunately, there's going to be a lot of misspellings in the census, and there's incorrect indexing of these records. There was a really great quote at Roots Tech 2024, which happened in March. So if you're not familiar with what Roots Tech is, it's this huge conference that Family Search does. And there was a session from a professional genealogist, Debbie Gertler, and she said this really great quote that I thought is so fitting for all of genealogy. She said, if you haven't tried to search 5, 6, 7 different ways, you haven't tried hard enough. So always keep that in mind when you're searching genealogy, and especially in census records, because sometimes it's really difficult to find who you're looking for, even though you know they should be there. But hopefully, some of the tips and tricks I'm going to give you today are going to help you locate your ancestor with ease, so you won't have to search 5, 6, 7 different ways, and maybe you'll find them on the 3rd or 4th try. So one way you can try to find your ancestors if they're a little difficult to find is consider using wildcards to help you search. This does work in census records, but it also works for other records as well, depending on the website. So for example, you could use it on a newspaper search. You could do wildcards, for example. So what is a wildcard? Well, I can use a wildcard to replace a single unknown letter. So for example, if I have the surname Nielsen, and between the S and the N, I'm not sure, did they spell it with an E? Do they spell it with an O? Do they spell it with an I? Do they spell it with an A? What letter is between that S and N? Or maybe it's misspelled multiple different ways in different records. So I'm going to put a wildcard in between the S and the N to get all of those results that are spelled that way. I can also find names that begin with the same letter. I can use it to find first letters. So if an S is misindexed as a K, for example, and I can use wildcards to find alternative spellings of the same name. So I have a niece whose name is Kaylee, and this is how she spells it with an I and an L-E-Y. But some people spell it with a Y, L-E-E, or a Y and a L-E-I-G-H. There's multiple different ways to spell a certain name. So by using wildcards, I can try to get all of the results in a search without having to search, 6, 7, 8 different ways with all these misspellings, which you could still do if you'd like. So what are the wildcards? The star, which you can see up here, it's going to represent between 0 and 5 characters. And to get that star, you're going to look at your keyboard. There's going to be the Shift key and the number 8. You can see right above the number 8 is that little star. So you can push both the Shift and the 8 at the same time if you're using a PC. Or if you have a little keypad on the side that has the numbers, there's going to be a little star above the 9 on your keypad. So that's how you would get that star. So why would I use the star? Well, for example, I would want to find different spellings of Matthew or Matthias or Matilda. Well, I could use a star after MAT, And then it's going to give me all the results of Matthew spelled with one T or two T, Matthias spelled with one T or two T's, Matilda spelled with an H or without an H. Obviously, this is a really broad search, so I'd get a lot of results, but this is just an example of how you might want to use a wildcard between 0 and 5 characters. And then going back to our other example with Nielsen spelled multiple different ways between the S and the N, this is how I would use a wildcard. I would use the question mark, which there's a little spot on your keyboard that has the question mark right next to the shift bar. That's going to be able to replace one character only. So you want to hold the shift and that question mark slash key, so it will give you the question mark. And then if I put that question mark between the S and the N, that's going to be all these different spellings of Nielsen. So whatever different letter you can think of between the S and the N, it's going to give me those results. Just be aware with wildcards that all searches containing a wildcard must have at least 3 non-wildcard letters. So for example, you could do a search that's star ILL. That would work because there's 3 letters. But if I just do star IL, it's not going to work because it needs another letter in there. Also, the first and the last character in a search can't both be wildcards. So I can do a question mark at the beginning, or I can do a star at the end, but I can't do a question mark and a star at the beginning and end. It's not going to work that way. It also isn't going to work if you have what's called Soundex search on. So Soundex is an algorithm that they use to search for alternative spellings of a name using the way it's pronounced. So Smith might be spelled a couple different ways, or maybe it was mistyped and the I is missing, but it's still pronounced the same way. So if you have that Soundex search turned on in Ancestry or Family Search, for example, you'd want to turn that off in order to use the wildcards. So now I'm going to show you how to look at the Census Records in Heritage Quest, which is a free database you could use from home. So to start, you're going to go to apl.org. You always want to start through your library's website if your library subscribes to Heritage Quest. For those watching outside of Wisconsin, want to check and see if your local library subscribed to Heritage Quest. But for those who live in Wisconsin, Heritage Quest is provided for us for free, so any Wisconsin residents can get Heritage Quest. To get to Heritage Quest, you want to start at our website, apl.org. You're going to click on eLibrary up here in the top. This is going to give you an A to Z listing of all of our databases. But since we know we're going to a genealogy one, I can click right here where it says genealogy to narrow down to just the genealogy ones. And then I'm going to find Heritage Quest online right there. So now you might come to a screen that's going to ask you to log in, either by using your library card number and selecting what library system you're a part of, or if you don't have a library card, that's okay. You can still access Heritage Quest. What you can do is you can type in Wisconsin and then enter your zip code below. So right here, I would type in my zip code and click Login. Now I'm on the Heritage Quest website. So there's 2 different ways that you can search Heritage Quest for census records. The first way to do it is by going to this top search area right here in the upper left corner and clicking on search. Right here, you can see where it says search census. So this is just for the US censuses. So I can either click on a specific year if I'm looking for 1930, for example, or if I want to search through all of them, I would click on all. Then it's going to give me a search bar where I can type in my ancestor's name, first name and last name. I can put in some additional details like the year of birth, the location of the birth. And then when I'm ready, I can click search. I do want to encourage you not to fill in a bunch of information in this box because the more information you fill in, the more it's going to narrow your search. So things like their death information is usually not included in the census. But you maybe want to add some family members down here. You can add the father, the mother, a sibling, a spouse, a child, for example. But for now, I'm just going to keep it with the first name, last name, year of birth, and location of the birth, and click search. So again, you might want to try searching a couple different ways when you're searching the census. But you can see right here, I've already got 64 results for this person that I'm looking for. So I can hover over it and see kind of a snapshot overview of what's included in this record. So I can see, does this match my ancestor? Okay, living in Madison in 1940. I can scroll down and see, oh yeah, that's his wife's name, that's his son's name. So this is probably my ancestor. So what I can do is I can click on that image there, and it's going to bring me right into the image of the census. And thankfully, Heritage Quest helpfully highlights it for you, so you can see where on the page that person occurs. And then you can hover over the different things instead of having to scroll all the way up to the top. You can see they have the headings up here helpfully for you, or you can highlight or hover over a different word, and it'll say what that information is. It kind of helps you analyze this record a little bit easier, so you can see all the data pieces that are pulled out in Heritage Quest. The other really great thing is that I can save or print a copy of this. So to do that, there's a save button up here. If you click send image home, it's going to ask for your email address, and then it will email you a copy of it. But I usually always save to this computer, and then it's going to ask you to save to your computer. If you just want to print it, you can also go to this little wrench icon in the tool menu. There's an option to either print or download here as well. So I encourage you to save these to your computer and back them up, or print them out if you would like to do that. So here again is how the 1940 census looks for my ancestor. If I want to go back to all the results again, I would click the back arrow, and then I can move on to the next one. I can view the 1950 census either by hovering over this or by clicking view where that little icon is next to the picture. It's going to bring me right into that record right away without me kind of giving a little preview of it. So here's that 1950 census we looked at earlier on Family Search. So here is family again. So like I mentioned before, there is a second way you can search on Census Records. So I'm going to go back to the home page of Heritage Quest. And instead of clicking this top search box up here, I'm going to scroll down. So you can see there's a spot for the US Census. There's also a spot for the Canadian Census. So if you do have an ancestor who lived in Canada from 1825 to 1921, you might want to search those census records for Canada for them. But since I'm looking for a US ancestor, I'm going to click search now. And again, it brings me right into that box that I already filled in with all that relevant information on my ancestor who was living in the United States. The other thing I wanted to show you is how to get to some of the international censuses. So like you saw, there was the US Census, there's Canada censuses, but what about European countries or South American countries? So again, I can go back to the search bar. Instead of clicking up here, this is just US censuses. I want to scroll all the way down and see also what other cool stuff Heritage Quest has, of course. But there's a spot down here that says search records in other locations. So for example, I could click South America and see, oh, look at, they have an Argentina national census for 1869. So let me go ahead and search in that. So you can now search in it and search for your ancestor who might live there. So I personally don't have any Argentina ancestors in 1869, but just to show you what it looks like and how it looks very different from our US Census, I just want to pull up one quick for you to show you what it looks like. So look at it, it looks very different from a US Census. So it kind of gives the same information like their name, their age, their sex. I don't read Spanish, so I don't know all of these words, but I know this is profession, so their occupation, things like that. So again, you can see kind of what data is given here and how that compares to the census for the United States. And again, you can also download or save these here as well. They don't have a ton of international countries on Heritage Quest. You will find some also on Family Search, which we're dive into now. But again, you can just keep searching in whatever relevant countries or continents you wanted to search in and see what records are available for free from home. Now we're going to do a quick demonstration of how to find census records on Family Search. So again, this is a free site. I do recommend that you have a free Family Search account first and make sure that you're signed in. So you can see I'm already signed in here. So what I want to do is I want to go to search and click on records. And again, there's a couple different ways that you can search here. So again, I can start typing in my ancestors' information here. You can see on these boxes here, it doesn't indicate, okay, do they want the birth year or the death year? So I always click on this more options first because then it allows you to click on birth and fill in specifically the birth information. And then here you can put in a range. So say I would put in 1901 to 1905 for my ancestor who I know was born in 1903, but maybe, depending on when the census was taken, has he had a birthday or not yet? Maybe I want to have a little bit of a range instead of that actual birth year. And I can click on search. Again, you could add some more information if you wanted to, but again, don't add too much information because it's going to narrow down your searches then. So now you can see, I can see some census records, I can see a birth index, I can see a social security file, but if I just want to look at census records, what I can do first is click up here where it says collection. And you can see over here, pops up a little screen where you can select if you want birth, marriage, and death records, census military records, other collections. So if I just want census records, I'm going to click on all for census and then apply collection filter. So now this is just going to give me, you can see I have 10 results instead of the over 100 results that I had before. So now I have the census here for my ancestor. Every time you see a little camera icon, that means they have an actual image of that census. So again, I can click into it and look at the census. And thankfully, they helpfully highlight it here for you where your ancestor is. So again, this is the 1950 census we looked at earlier for this family. If I wanted to go back to those results, I could click back. I did also want to encourage you that sometimes the information you see as a little snapshot here is a little confusing and it's not always accurate. So for example, I see this 1920 result for Bureau Township in Illinois. I think, I don't think my great-grandfather ever lived in Illinois. That's so weird. That doesn't make sense to me. And look, there's two different results for the same one. So I'm going to click on one of them and see what pops up. I would encourage you to look at both of them too, but for now, we're just going to look at one of them. So I can zoom in and see, okay, where is he in here? Let's see if I can find him. So here he is right here. Like, well, why is he living in Illinois? Well, if you look at the top, it actually tells you this is name of a military or naval station or vessel. So he's actually stationed on the USS Ward, which is docked at San Diego, California. But for whatever reason, it unfortunately said Bureau Township of Illinois. So that's why, don't always go off based off that index. Always look into the actual image and make sure you're reading the actual image of it because some things might be a little bit incorrect. But now I can zoom in, I can see what information it gives on him and where he's originally from. I've got an address of where he lived in Nina when he's not stationed on the ship, how old he is, some very similar questions, of course, that they ask in the census, because this is actually a census record. It's just different because it's being taken of all the people on the ship that are serving our country. So I can, again, see all the information here, and I can easily download that record right here by clicking this little arrow with the line underneath icon. I can zoom in and zoom out using these, or I also have it on my mouse that I can zoom in and zoom out. So it's very helpful. If it's a little dark for you, you can also make some adjustments using this little adjust icon. So I can play with the brightness, make it a little brighter or a little darker if I need to, or play with the contrast a little bit to see if I can make it a little bit more readable as well. So that's something that you can do in Family Search, which is really helpful. Again, we're going to go back out to that search page and I'm going to show you another way that you can search for different census records without using that name search. So instead of filling in this box, what you can do is you can type in a state or a different country and the word census and see what kind of results I get. So I can see here, there's a bunch of New York State censuses. So maybe I want to search for my ancestors who I knew are living there. So I'm going to type in Ira Holmes and click search. And now you can see there's a bunch of different census records. Again, you kind of get a little snapshot of who might be in the home and see, oh, yeah, this is my ancestor right here. I know this is his wife. Those are his kids that I'm looking for. And again, I can click on that image and get into this record to be able to see it, to be able to read a little bit more, because of course, not everything is in that index. And then here they are right there. So sometimes Family Search highlights it for you, sometimes it doesn't. So just be aware of that. You might need to poke around on the page a little bit to see where they are. And I did want to point out, it's really awesome that this New York census is asking what county of the state that they were born in. So now I know exactly what county in New York my ancestor is born in when I find them on the state census. You can also use this for international censuses. So if we go back to this find a collection, you can put in anything in here. You can put in England census, for example, and I can see, oh, there's England and Wales censuses. So again, I can either search by last name or I can start browsing. This one I wanted to show you because it's going to pop up and say, oh, unfortunately, you can't access this online. I have to access it at a Family Search Center or at a Family Search affiliate library. So thankfully, us at Appleton Public Library, we are an affiliate library. So what you would want to do is you would want to write down this film number or write down, hey, I want to look at this England and Wales census 1861. Then you come to the library. Once you're in the library, you'll be able to see the actual images for the census. You'll be able to download them, print them, save them however you wanted to. Only when you're in the library, though, because we're an affiliate library, we have access to a certain subset of records that you just can't access from home. But again, they have lots of other international censuses on here that you can access from home. So feel free to poke around and see what's available for your ancestors. All right, some important things to know about the census. So like I mentioned earlier, because of privacy laws, there's a 72-year restriction on accessing our US censuses, but you can easily access from 1790 to 1950 on all the major genealogy websites. So Family Search, like I just showed you, on Ancestry, both the library and the paid edition. Of course, the library edition is only available in use in the library, or you can use Heritage Quest from home, which has all the US censuses. So also a couple other sites that have it, but those are kind of the main three. Because of the 72 years, the next census, the 1960 census, is not going to be released until April 2032, which feels like so long ago. But last year we did get access to the 1950 census. So hopefully you recognize some names in there, like your parents, or perhaps even yourself is in that 1950 census. Also, it's important to know that each country is going to handle access to their censuses differently. So again, start with that Family Search Wiki to see when is a census available, what censuses are available online that I can easily access. So for example, Canada just released the 1931 census last year. So that's a 92-year restriction. So that's a lot more than our 72-year restriction. And they're all also a bunch of international censuses available online, or some, like I showed you earlier with that England and Wales census, you can access at an affiliate library or at a Family Search Center, which are little kind of satellite locations all throughout the world. So when that pop-up came up on your screen, you can click on that to determine where your closest Family Search Center or closest affiliate library is if you're not close to Appleton. There is some reported record loss of censuses for the United States from 1790, 1800, and 1810. So if you are looking for an ancestor during those time periods of those really early censuses and you don't find them, just be aware, of course, they might be a part of those records that were lost, or you might need to try to search differently. So remember, try searching 5, 6, 7 different ways, or even more different ways before you give up and say, oh, my ancestor just isn't in here. Also, the 1890 census is also damaged. So it was damaged in a fire in 1921 at the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. and very little of it exists. So just a few countries or counties around the United States exist. So see the link in your handout that will detail which counties specifically exist still. The great thing is if you had a veteran or a widow of a veteran from the Civil War, there was an 1890 veterans schedule that exists for many states. Again, that was partially damaged as well, so there are only some states that exist yet. But if you did have a Civil War veteran or a widow of a veteran in one of those states, check it out on Family Search or on Heritage Quest for those records. So for example, I have one here that I found on Family Search for my ancestor Ira Holmes. So we're going to zoom in so that you can read it all here. So you can see this is kind of like a supplemental schedule. So it says special schedule, surviving soldiers, sailors, Marines, and widows. So that's who you're going to find here. So I see him right here. I can see what house number he's living at. I can see his rank, what company and regiment he served in, when he enlisted, when he was discharged. You're supposed to be able to see the length of their service, but the census taker didn't fill that information out. And just like we saw in the earlier censuses, there's a little number over here. So I want to scroll down to the bottom and you can see, oh, I get an actual address of where he's living on Richmond Street in Appleton. And I can see he actually had a disability due to his military service. So now I know, hey, I can go and get a pension file for him and learn a little bit more about his disability and how his service caused that disability. So you might find other great remarks in here or learn a little bit more about their service in here. So again, if you have a Civil War veteran or a widow of a veteran, definitely check out this 1890 veteran schedule. Older censuses, so those pre-1850 censuses, unfortunately only list a head of household by name. It's usually the man of the house, and then very few details are recorded. So they're usually kind of giving a number count for selected age groups like females under the age of 5 or females between 5 and 10. It's unfortunately a little difficult to work with these pre-1850 censuses, but don't let that discourage you. I always encourage people to start with the most recent census you can find your ancestor in, and then work your way backwards. So if your ancestor died in 1922, you know the last census they're going to appear in is 1920. So you start with 1920, go to 1910, go to 1900, or remember there's going to be maybe some state censuses in there, or you can find them in the city directories as well, or other records like a newspaper article where you can find out more information about where they're living and when they're living there. So again, it's always easiest to start with most recent stuff and then work your way back to their birth information. So quickly, I'm going to tell you about how I use the pre-1850 censuses and make it not so difficult. So what I do is I take a list of all the people in a given family and I write out how old they will be in a census. So for example, one of the people might be Paul, who was born in 1830. Then I'm going to write down in 1840, he's going to be 10. In 1850, he's going to be 20. In 1860, he's going to be 30, et cetera, until he dies. I write down his age in those census years. Then I'm going to take that list census that I found for a pre-1850 census that I think might be this family based on the name of the head of household, the surname of that house, and does it seem to match? So I'm going to take the listing of all the people in the family and I'm going to try to match it to everyone that's in the census that I found to see, does all the key details match? Keeping in mind that sometimes young females may marry and be out of the household, or maybe they're working outside of the home at 16. Maybe older boys are farming on their own or living with someone else and working when they're 16 or 17 as well. So kind of keep that in mind, that maybe some of those older children might be out of the house already. So what I do then is I created a little table in Microsoft Word to help me kind of compare these details. You can easily make a list in a notebook if you'd like, or match up people using a software or some other way that makes sense to you. But for me, creating a little table in Microsoft Word is pretty easy. So what I do is I use all the data I have from my more recent censuses on that family before I try to figure out all the pre-1850 stuff and making sure all the names and ages I know that information before I try to dive into those 1850 censuses, and I make sure I found everybody in that family for every census. Even those young females who have married and are outside of the house, I find them in later censuses before I dive into those pre-1850 censuses. So now I'm going to show you an example. So this is a little snapshot of what the 1830 census looks like. Not very easy to deal with. So like the other censuses we looked at, you don't get a whole lot of data. So I'm going to zoom in just so you can read it a little bit easier. So you can see there's all these different age groups. So first they do the man and different age groups like under 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 15. And then they do the females over here on the other side. So you can see these different age groups and then the tick marks corresponding to those age groups. So here I'm looking at the Aaron Cutting family living in Lisbon, New York in 1830. And so I'm going to write down all of these tick marks and what ages this corresponds to. I'm going to compare that to the people that I know should be in this family based on my other research. So you can see they've got 4 tick marks in the 1830 census that I wrote down in one part of my spreadsheet. And then in my other part of my spreadsheet or my table, I wrote down the name of the person and approximately what age they'd be. So I can see Aaron was about 36. Well, there's a man in the house between age 30 and 39, assuming it's Aaron because he's the head of household listed on the census. And that age makes sense. There's a female under the age of 5. Well, I know that they had a daughter named Cordelia, who was about age 2 at the time. Well, that matches. Mary is another one of the daughters. She would be about 6. And look at, there's a female between age 5 and 9. That makes sense. And then there's one more female between age 30 and 39. And I know the mom of Mary and Cordelia, Margaret, she would be about age 31. So all of these tick marks are fitting with these people in the family and what their ages would be. So for me, this makes sense that this is my family that I'm looking for. And again, those names and that approximate ages that I have for this family are going to be what the family looked like in the 1850 census, the 1860, 1870, all those later censuses where they're listed all by name and by age. So I know exactly who's in this family, even before we just get to the tick marks only. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about errors in the census. So just like any other census record type or genealogy record type, there's going to be errors, of course, in the census. So some common errors you might see in the census records are incorrect age. So they might be off by a few years. Maybe somebody used a nickname instead of their legal birth name. That happens a lot in census records. Maybe their immigration is off by a couple of years if they immigrated. You know, it's kind of hard to remember sometimes exactly when that happened. Or again, we don't know who's giving that information. Maybe it's the neighbor, maybe it's the mother-in-law, maybe it's the mom who's trying to remember 10 of her kids and what ages they all are and all their names or using their nicknames. It's a lot of information to give out when we have very large families or we're in the midst of our workday of tending to our farm and this guy just comes to our house and asks all these questions. Just think about putting yourself in your ancestors' shoes for a second to see why they might have accidentally given incorrect information or maybe the census taker heard things a little differently. So remember, again, only one adult in the household, possibly a neighbor, is answering those questions for everyone. So they could have been given incorrect information accidentally. Or just like us, you know, our ancestors might be a little fuzzy on some of the details. So take that into account that, you know, things might be just a smidge off. And again, always use the information you find in a census record to lead you to additional records to try to find some more proof to confirm or deny that information. So if you see that ancestor was born about 1903 in Wisconsin, don't just take that as proof that that's when they were born. Follow up and try to find a 1903 birth record or a 1902 birth record or a 1901 birth record that confirms, oh, this is exactly what dates they were born in and exactly where in Wisconsin they were born. So again, using the clues from the census to find actual physical records that will prove information or give you more detailed information. Spelling of the surnames is very incorrect on many census records, making it just a little bit more difficult to find your family. So if you think about it, if somebody could not or did not spell their name out for a census taker often wrote it out how it sounded. So It could sound any different way to a person. Remember, some of our foreign-born ancestors likely had accents that maybe were difficult for people to hear what they were properly saying. So that might be another kind of layer of trying to write something out phonetically when you've heard it differently. Um, Again, sometimes they're using nicknames or sometimes they write abbreviations. So you might see WM for William instead of William written out completely. Or John I've seen as JNO. So that's another thing that might be making it difficult to find your ancestors when you're doing that keyword search. Again, sometimes that person who's giving information gave incorrect information accidentally, or perhaps they knowingly lied. Especially when you think about relationships, maybe you see a family is listing a grandchild as an actual child instead of a grandchild that they are, because maybe their daughter had that child out of wedlock. So they're raising that grandchild as their child because they don't want everybody to know that something shameful happened at this time period. It's shameful for your child to have a child out of wedlock. So they're lying about this and saying this is our child when it's really their grandchild. Sometimes information is just copied wrong or indexed wrong. So I found in several records that my surname of Stilp was indexed as Kelp, K-E-L-P. Well, my last name is S-T-I-L-P, so a little bit different. So, you sometimes need to get very creative of, maybe that's how it sounded to that person who was taking that census information or writing that record and how they thought it should be spelled. Start with the most recent census, that your ancestor is going to be in and work your way back. So just like I mentioned earlier, if they died in 1922, most recent census they're going to be in is 1920. So always start there, work your way back to the earliest census that they're going to be in. If you can't find your ancestor in a census, or the image is really difficult to read on one of the sites, I would try searching in a different site. So for example, if you try searching for them on Heritage Quest and you don't get any results or it's not the right person, try that search in Family Search or on Ancestry. Sometimes, they have different indexes, so you might be able to easily find them in Family Search, whereas you couldn't find them in Heritage Quest. Maybe an image is really dark or hard to read, so try a different site. Again, this works for other record types other than census records, so I always encourage you to try multiple different sites. Because again, those indexes are different, the image quality is going to be different. I personally feel like it's easier to enhance or lighten images a little bit easier on Family Search than it is on Heritage Quest and Ancestry. So usually if I'm going to try to play around with lightening or playing with the contrast in an image, I'm going to try to do that in Family Search. If you know that your ancestors are supposed to be in a certain place, you can always pull up that town or that city and then browse page by page for that family. Obviously, this is really helpful for smaller towns or smaller cities, but not so helpful for large cities. Like you don't want to go through all of Chicago or all of New York City trying to find your ancestors. But thankfully, if you do have an address, like maybe you found one in a city directory or a newspaper article where it listed their address, you want to try to find what's called the enumeration district. So all of the United States is broken up into smaller districts that the census takers were then in charge of that certain district. And they would go, door to door in that district. That's this, couple block radius to try to record the people in that district. So then I would try to find that enumeration district based on that address. And then it's maybe only 30 pages you need to go through. So there's a link to Steve Morse. He has a site that has information on what those enumeration districts are based on those addresses, as well as how to find things like to change street names, some maps. There's different census codes and what the codes mean on there, and so much more. So definitely check out that link in the handout. All right. I also want to encourage you to look at the index and look at the actual image at the same time. So of course, when we're looking at census records, some of the handwriting might be a little bit difficult to read. And maybe if you're looking at the index, you can easily spot a misindexed surname. Or maybe looking at the image is a little bit easier for you to spot that misindexed surname. So that's why I always try to look at both of them together. And I'll show you what I mean right here. So here's an example of what it looks like on Family Search. So you can see right here, I've got the image pulled up of a 1900 census. So I can see how the names are spelled. And then over here on the right-hand side, this is the index that somebody has typed saying, okay, we think this is what it says for that person's name. So you can kind of compare both of them and look at the same time to see if one of them is really your ancestor and it just might be a little bit misspelled. You could also move this to the bottom of the screen if you prefer that. Instead, I think using this little pencil icon or this little icon is the magical button that moves it from that side of the screen to the bottom of the screen for you. You can also do the same thing in Heritage Quest or in Ancestry, either the paid edition or the library edition. It looks the same. So again, up here you can see this census records. This is the 1920 census. You can see it's a little hard to read some of these names on an actual image, but thankfully down here we've got the index of what somebody thinks it's what it says. So again, we want to look at both at the same time to be able to see what we're looking at and see, does it match with what my eyes think this word is or what this letter is. I also wanted to point out the relationships on here that are on the censuses are to the head of the household, and that's usually the male of the household if it's a husband-wife family unit. Of course, if the man's dead or they're divorced, it might be a female head of household, of course. But keep that in mind. So for this family, for example, John Ketchel is the head of the household, and you can see there's a brother listed here. So we know Harry Ketchel is the brother to John because the relationship is to the head. It's not the brother to Myrtle. It's not the brother to Gertrude. Harry is the brother to John. So again, this is an easy way for us to determine some sibling relationships sometimes if you've got siblings living together later in life as well. Also, I just want to point out that you can't prove with a census alone that the woman of the house is the mother of all the children that are listed, unless she's listed as the head of the house and all those relationships are explicitly stated. These are children. It's the son, it's the daughter. But even then, you still want to get more records to verify these relationships. You want birth records confirming that this is the mother to those children. So think about this scenario. You've got a male head of the household. He had children with his first wife, and she died 8 years ago. He remarried 5 years ago, and he had children with both of his wives. All of these children are listed on one census with him as the head of the household. But who is the mother to all of these children? You can't automatically assume that it's the second wife, just because that's the wife that he's married to at that time. The second wife could have also been remarried and have children by her first husband who are now being raised by the second husband, and they changed their surname. So again, there's all these complicated family relationships that just by the census alone, you can't say this woman is the mother of all of these 10 children listed in this house, for example. You need to locate more records, locate more than one source for each fact, and never make an assumption, especially based off the census records alone and one little tiny clue. Use that clue to find more research to back up those assumptions that you might have. Now we're going to dive into state censuses. So several states in the United States also took a census like we showed earlier. There was a Wisconsin state census and a New York state census. It's really kind of random. Not all states took a census. Not all the censuses that were taken by states survive. What's really great about these state censuses is that they may provide more information on your ancestors in the years between the federal censuses. And the information that they ask on the state censuses, it varies depending on the different states. So New York state census is different from Wisconsin state census. The 1850 or the 1865 census and the 1875 census for states is going to be different. Sometimes you get more detailed information on a state census, like I showed earlier an example of a New York state census where it had a birth location of what county in New York that person was born. So again, sometimes we get more detail, but again, all the questions are going to vary census year to census year, state to state. There's a really great overview of state censuses for every year, which is linked to your handout that's on the U.S. State Census or U.S. Census Bureau website. So right here, it's a quick snapshot of what states and what years they did censuses. And so you can see at a glance, hey, if I have Connecticut ancestors, there's no state census records that are known to exist. So don't bother searching for them. Whereas if I have a Mississippi ancestor, look at all these years that they took state censuses. This is really helpful information for me to be able to see quickly at a glance what states did a census. I also could go into the Family Search Wiki for the individual states, like we looked at New York earlier. And again, it had links with many of those records being found on Family Search. Again, here's that snapshot of what that New York State Census looked like in 1855. And again, seeing right here in this middle column here, where it says what county in that state they were born. But of course, you also get people who are internationally born. So you see Ireland, or there's somebody who was born in Vermont. So unfortunately, you don't always get that detailed information if they were born outside of that state or outside of that country. But thankfully for my New York ancestors, I now have one county instead of a whole slew of counties to try to look for them to see if I'm able to locate birth records or church records or other records in those locations for them. Just quickly, I want to talk about the Wisconsin state and territorial censuses. So Wisconsin conducted a head of household count, so similar to those pre-1850 censuses where you just get the tick marks. Those were in the 1855, 1875, 1885, and 1895 census, and those are available on Family Search and on Ancestry, both the library and the paid edition. And then they also did a partial state census in 1865, which was only 6 counties, and that's only found on Family Search. And then the full state census was done in 1905, where it lists all of the people in the household. So not just the tick marks, it's going to list every single person. And that's going to be available on Family Search and on Ancestry, both the library and the paid edition. Prior to becoming a state, Wisconsin also did some territorial censuses. So the state became a state in 1848. Before that, they did some territorial censuses in 1836, 1838, 1842, 1846, and 1847, basically kind of trying to prove, hey, we've got enough people to become a state. These are not online at all at this time. They're only available, I believe, at the Wisconsin Historical Society that I'm aware of in Madison. So again, if you have an ancestor who lived here before we became a state, that's definitely something you'd want to check out. And then in the 1820 and 1830 federal census, keep in mind this is before Wisconsin became a state, so they are actually counted under the Michigan Territory. And then in 1840, they are featured in the federal census under Wisconsin Territory before it again became a state in 1848. But in 1850, in the federal census, of course, it would be listed under Wisconsin when it's officially a state. And again, here's an example of the 1905 Wisconsin State Census where it has all the heads of household and all of the residents in a given residence. And I just want to point out that I found this one on Ancestry, a paid version of Ancestry, but I could not locate this family on Family Search. So they do have the 1905 Wisconsin State Census on Family Search. And this is in Howe, which is a town in Oconto County. And they had about 8 pages of Howe on Family Search, but on Ancestry, they have about 12 pages. So it sometimes makes sense for checking different sites. If you don't find them in one area, definitely check another. So again, I tried Heritage Quest, it wasn't on there. I did try Ancestry Library Edition, it was on there. Wasn't on Family Search, it was on Ancestry Paid Edition as well. So again, checking multiple sites for the same records, because you never know if they're missing a couple pages or they're filed some weird way where you aren't finding them for some reason. There's of course also international censuses, like we showed an example earlier of the Argentina one. So again, their availability is going to depend on the laws of the countries. Of course, start with the main genealogy sites like Family Search, Ancestry, both the paid and the library edition, and Heritage Quest. So you can find a lot of Canadian, Ireland, England, Wales, Denmark, Norway, and Germany. There's a link, of course, to Family Search Wiki. There's a whole entry that has census records by country down here. So I'm just going to click into it and show you what it looks like and how you can do that. Or as we showed earlier, when we went into the Family Search Wiki, you can just type in that country name and the word census. So for example, I could click on census records in Germany. And I see there's actually two different versions. There's a Germany as the country, or there's the province of Saxony, where it's part of the German Empire. So you might have something like that where the country changed boundaries or changed things like that. So again, you'd want to skim through this and see what available records there are. It's going to tell you when they took censuses, what information might be in that census, and give you links if there are digitized copies of them available online. Sometimes it'll give you a little snapshot of what it looks like, things like that, or point you to other online resources as well. So again, this is going to vary depending on all the different censuses. So you can see there's a bunch of Denmark ones because again, there's boundary changes, things like that, where parts of what is Germany now was part of Denmark at that time period. And then again, you can see if there's a dollar sign, that means it's going to be something that you need to pay for or have a subscription to that site. So again, all these different country ones some of them are more detailed than others, but this is a great starting point no matter what location you're looking for records for. Here's an example, just quickly, of the 1931 Canadian census. So you can see it's kind of interesting. They have it in English and in French, so it's really awesome. Obviously, some of the other ones, like we looked at the Argentina one earlier, it was just completely in Spanish. So if you don't speak Spanish, you gotta try to figure out what the words are. But this one, thankfully, it's easy to read, and you can see they're asking a lot of the same data as the US Census, but it's just a little bit different and just laid out a little bit differently as well. So again, every census is going to be different depending on the location and even year to year within the same locations. Now we're going to dive into the non-population schedules. So these are kind of special censuses that were taken that might be helpful to your research, that were completed during the same years as the federal census, but not always completed every census. So we're going to talk about the mortality schedules, agricultural schedules, manufacturing and industrial schedules, the defective, dependent, and delinquent schedule, and the social statistics schedules. Many of these are available on Heritage Quest, on Ancestry, both the paid and the library edition, and on Family Search, but of course not all of them are. There are still records that are not digitized and available online. So first is the mortality schedule. So this collects information on the people who died during the 12 months previous to that census date. Unfortunately, the deaths were a little underreported on these, so if you do find an ancestor on these, you will be lucky, and it might be the only record you have of that death. Maybe there's no obituary in the newspaper, or there's no physical death record. Like we talked about vital records last month, this might be the only spot you find that somebody died and what they died from. So these mortality schedules were collected from 1850 to 1880. So in a lot of cases before it was legally required to have a vital record. And then the states that took an 1885 census also did a mortality schedule for this year as well. Nearly all of the available mortality schedules on Ancestry, both the paid and the library edition, and they also have some on Family Search, but they are very incomplete. For the 1870, 1880, and 1885 schedule, there's this really helpful number in column 1 that will help you connect that person to a family in the population schedule. And I'll show you what I mean in a second when we look at an actual image. And then also 1871 in Canada, they did a mortality schedule, and it's available on Ancestry and on Family Search. There might be other countries who also have done mortality schedules. I didn't dig that deep. Again, it's going to vary depending on where you're searching and what time period you're searching, and if they're available online or not available online. So I would start with the Family Search Wiki to see where to proceed from there. So here's an example. I'm going to zoom in just a second, but I wanted to let you know that Wisconsin is only available on Heritage Quest and on Ancestry, both paid and the library editions, for their mortality schedule. They do have lots of other states on these sites as well, and on Family Search. Again, be sure to check all of the sites, and don't ignore this bottom part that has some additional notes down here. So sometimes you'll see something like, oh, number 1 drowned while bathing. So it might give you some additional details about what happened in that death, or if there was some big Spanish flu, that people, several people died from, or several people in a household died from. It might explain it a little bit more. So zooming in, I wanted to show you, this is what I mean by the first column. So you can see it has number 40 here. Then I would go to the town of Grand Chute in the 1870 census where all the people are listed again in the population part. And I would find family number 40. I would know that that was the family that reported this person died and that those are likely relatives of this person. So similar to what you see in the population schedule, it's going to ask things like their age, their sex, their race, their marital status, where they were born, and if their parents were foreign born, what month they died. So now you have a month instead of just a year as well, which is really helpful. And then it will list their occupation and then their cause of death, of course. And then again, be sure to read those remarks down there. For this one, I didn't have anything interesting, but sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. Next up, we're going to talk about the agricultural schedules. So these contain information on every farm with an annual produce worth $100 or more. And that includes the name of the owner or the tenant. So if your ancestors were renting a farm, they would be included in this schedule. And then they also have the kind and the value of their acreage, what machinery they had, the livestock, and then what they produced on this farm in a lot of details. So censuses from 1850 to 1910 had agricultural schedules. Unfortunately, in 1900 and 1910 were destroyed by congressional action, so you won't find them at all, which is a really big bummer for those of us who have farming ancestors. But for the other years, from 1850 to 1900, you're able to find them. And then they are available online on Ancestry, both the library and the paid edition, as well as Heritage Quest. But of course, not all are online. There's very few on Family Search. You're going to want to search the keyword of non-population schedules. That's where you're going to find these agricultural schedules, as well as some of the other schedules we're going to talk about in just a second. Wisconsin is not online at all. The closest place that I know of to Appleton that has them is the Brown County Library in downtown Green Bay. These are on the same microfilm rolls as the population schedules, but they're at the absolute end of the microfilm roll. So you want to look for a little box that has a red dot on it, and you can view these microfilm anytime the library is open because their microfilm is available just like a regular book would be. If you have a farmer in your family, I definitely encourage you to go get a copy of it, and you'll see an example in just a second. But I can tell you in so much detail what my farming ancestors did in Wisconsin, so it's definitely a worthwhile resource. Be aware these are also usually multiple pages. They're usually 2 pages, so be sure to get both pages, of course. So one example that is online is the Kentucky one. So they ask a little bit different questions depending on the different crops and things that are available in this area. But you can see in Kentucky, it's giving the name of the person, the acreages of their land, and how much is improved and not improved, the value of that, all the different livestock. So you can see how many milk cows they had, how many sheep they had, how many horses, etc. And then it's going to go into all the different crops and how many bushels of crops there are, or information like that. And then on the second page, again, it's going to have more information on the crops, like for the different potatoes, the different dairy products that they might have produced. So how many pounds of butter did they produce that year? How many dozens of eggs did their chickens lay? Things like that. And then again, depending on the geographic region, it might ask more things like the amount of sugar or the different berries that they would have had, things like that. So all types of different crops and the value of those crops. Moving on to the manufacturing and industrial schedules. So these provide details about products, raw materials, assets, capital invested, and the number of employees in these different businesses. So these included businesses like mining, fishery, mercantile, manufacturing, and trading that produced at least $500 worth of product. So you might also find the sawmills, blacksmith shops, flour and feed grain mills, tanneries, coopers, which were barrel makers, or cheese making operations. So keep in mind, maybe some of our farming ancestors used these as side businesses, like they were the blacksmith and a farmer. So especially in rural areas, so you might find them in both of these schedules, in the agricultural one as well as the manufacturing industrial one. These started in 1810, but most of those have been lost from that year. Then they did it again in 1820, and then not again until 1850 to 1880. Again, there's some more details in your handout about what's included for these certain years, so definitely take a look at that. And just be aware it was known by different names throughout the censuses. So other than 1850 and 1860, it was called manufacturing schedule. In 1850 and 1860, it was called industrial schedules. Many of these, again, are available on Ancestry, the paid and the library edition, and on Heritage Quest. Again, they're under non-population schedules. But again, not every state is online, so follow up offline for states like Wisconsin that are not online. And again, Brown County Library is going to be where you're going to grab the microphone for those at the end of the population schedule rules. So here's an example of an Iowa one. So you can see there's a blacksmith, there's a boot and shoe dealer, there's a harness shop, and you can see the value of these materials, what kinds of materials they had, things like that. So lots of different details that you can locate in these schedules. Sometimes they're 1 pages, sometimes they're 2 pages. It really depends on the time period and the industry. This one, I believe, was only a 1-page one. Next up is the DDD schedule. So they call it DDD a lot, but it's the defective, dependent, and delinquent schedule. This was only done in 1880. It was a supplemental schedule that gives additional information on people in these different situations. And yes, unfortunately, these are the actual terms they used in the schedules, like idiots or blind inhabitants or homeless children. So they use these terms to define people. For each of the different situations, the census on this is actually going to give some definitions on how to properly classify these people and who is included in these groups. So definitely when you look at this, you understand maybe what the parameters were for your ancestor being declared an insane inhabitant. You can, of course, look at the instructions for each of these situations to determine, do you have an ancestor that may have fallen under one of these classifications that might be included in the schedule? If you look at the census for 1880, they do have some mental and physical defects that were part of questions asked in the population schedule. So they also have individuals that were listed in institutions. So they might list them as an inmate, even if it's not a prison, if it's a mental institute or an orphanage, they're going to be listed as an inmate, for example. In the 1880 census, you'll see a column on there where it identifies a person as blind, deaf, idiotic, insane, or permanently disabled. If there's a little tick mark there, you'll know that you're going to follow up to get the DDD schedule for that person because they're going to be included in the supplemental schedule and you'll learn a little bit more about what their situation was. So there's about 20 different states that are digitized and available online for the schedule. And those are going to be available on Ancestry, either the paid edition or the library edition, and on Heritage Quest. And you're, of course, going to follow up offline for those states that are not online if this is something you want to learn more about. Again, here's an example. They kind of have it chunked out based on what classification it is. So you can see insane inhabitants, and then it's going to list the person's name, where they're living, what the form of their disease is, the history of how long they've had that disease, and some additional questions that I know sometimes it's very difficult to read these situations these people are in. And, for example, this person is in an asylum. So you would be able to see that information and then, follow up to learn a little bit more to see maybe they still have records for that given asylum that you could find out a little bit more again. Next up is the social statistics schedule. So these were compiled in the 1850 to 1880 censuses. There is no information about specific individuals, but it does give you a really great snapshot of the community where your ancestor lived. So for each little political subdivision, it's going to tell the total value of all the real estate in that area, the amount of annual taxes collected, how many schools there are, how many teachers, how many students, the number and the types of libraries, how many books those libraries have. It's going to give you information about the newspapers that are there, including the name, type, and circulation. So was it a weekly paper? Was it a daily paper? How many people did it serve? So if you're wondering, oh, where can I find an obituary for my ancestor who lived in this area? This is a great way to figure out what newspapers were in existence during this time period. There's also information on church denominations, including how many people each church could seat and the value of the church property. So again, if you're wondering what churches were in existence during this time period, my ancestors lived in this area, this is a great spot to find out what churches were in existence and follow up to see, do they still exist, or how do I get their access to their church records where my ancestors might have been included. This also tells the number of paupers, both native and foreign-born, and the cost to support them, as well as the number of people in prisons, both native and foreign-born. It also gives some cool information about average wages, so how much farmhands were paid, how much day laborers and carpenters and domestic servants. So check your ancestors' wage here, what they might approximately be earning in this location if they have one of these careers. Again, some of these are available on Ancestry, on the library in the paid edition, and on Heritage Quest. Again, you're going to follow up and find them under non-population schedule. And then follow up offline for any states that are not available online if, again, you are curious to learn a little bit more about the community your ancestors lived in. So here's an example of one from Jasper County, Iowa. So again, you can see some of the valuations, some information on public debt, taxes, information on the library, different wages, the different schools, including college schools. If you scroll down, this is the bottom half of the page where it's going to talk about the different paupers, the different crime. Here's that information on the newspapers. So again, the names of the newspapers. It talks about the characters. So sometimes during this time period, they're either Republican or Democrat leaning. How often it's published, how many circulations there are, so how many people on average are reading it. So maybe one of the larger newspapers, that might be where your ancestors' obituary might appear. And then again, here's all the information on the different church denominations and information on those. So you could maybe follow up then to see if your ancestor is featured in one of these church records for one of these churches. There are a couple other miscellaneous other censuses. So check the main genealogy sites for these miscellaneous censuses and also voter lists. So things like the Indian census rolls or the Dawes rolls. They do have slave schedules, of course, for certain states. Unfortunately, it does list the slaveholder name and not the enslaved person. But sometimes you can kind of piece that information together to locate your enslaved ancestors. There's also a voter list in various states and countries. And then some territorial censuses are sometimes online, sometimes they're not digitized yet. Be sure to look at a collection description. If you see a little area on Family Search that says how to use this collection, be sure to read that because it's going to tell you more details on how to use that collection, including maybe this county's missing or what data you might expect to find in that collection or what potential updates might be happening to this collection. There's also a spot if you scroll down on Ancestry or on Heritage Quest where you can learn a little bit more about that collection before you do that keyword search. Just a heads up, there is about 540 collections on Ancestry Library Edition for census and voter lists, so it's mainly North America. It does have some European and some special censuses, so some of those non-population schedules we just talked about. There's a little bit less in Heritage Quest, but of course you can access Heritage Quest online without having to come to the library. It has all the United States censuses, some special censuses, some international censuses like Canada, colonial Central America, a few European, and a few South American ones. Then Family Search, they've got a little bit less. They've only got about 355 collections for the censuses and lists, but it does include international and US censuses, as well as some of the special censuses. So definitely check out both, of course. That's all I've got for you today. Our next Thompson Center session is going to be all about newspaper research, and that's going to be on Tuesday, April 23rd at 1 o'clock Central. So of course, be sure to join us live on Zoom or in person at Thompson Center if you've registered for in person. In the meantime, we have our next Find Your Ancestors session on Zoom, which will be on Saturday, April 13th at 2 p.m. Central. And that's going to be on finding females in U.S. naturalization records with Nancy Lowe. That one's not going to be recorded, so definitely be sure to attend live if you're able to. Otherwise, you're going to miss out on this great learning opportunity to learn how to find your female ancestors and those naturalization records. And then just quickly, one thing we added to the handout that I wanted to point out was some great information on some local and state genealogical societies. So thanks to Val, who's one of our attendees, she gave me some information about some of the local genealogy societies and the Wisconsin State Genealogical Society that I wanted to pass along. So it's got information on meetings, their newsletters, special events and projects that they might have. I'm presenting on April 15th at the Senior Computer User Groups meeting, which is in Appleton. I'm talking all about our library's genealogy resources. It's completely free to join, so definitely feel free to join us in person at the Borghini Center for that. In the meantime, there's also a State Genealogical Society conference happening on April 12th through the 13th in Oshkosh, so not that far from us in Appleton. The theme for that conference is all about writing and sharing your family history. And it is cheaper to register for that if you are a member. And of course, you get a membership for the whole year, which also gives you access to past recorded webinars. They do a monthly webinar every month, which you don't need to be a member to attend. But if you want to watch the recording, if you didn't get a chance to watch it live, you definitely want to be a member in order to access those and to access the handouts. And then don't also forget about the genealogy societies in the areas where your ancestor lived. So there's a state society or a county group in your area where your ancestors lived. Maybe they have webinars that you can join if you don't live near that area, or they have newsletters or special events, or they're postable news snippets about local resources that might be beneficial to you to research in that geographic location. For example, even living in Wisconsin, I have ancestors from Peoria County, Illinois. So I joined the Peoria County Genealogical Society to be able to attend their webinars, to be able to get their newsletter, to learn more about researching in that area, and just to support that group and what they're doing to preserve the Peoria County, Illinois history. So again, don't forget about those types of groups. Again, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Feel free to send me an email. My email address is on the handout or on the screen, or you can give us a call at our reference desk and we will be sure to get back to you. All right, thanks everyone. Take care.